I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This week I'm talking peonies with Alec White of Primrose Peonies. If you attended this year's Chelsea Flower Show, you probably saw the amazing gold-winning stand Alec put together in the floral marquee. It was the one with the bath, peonies spilling everywhere, and the semi-nude model painted all over with peonies. It certainly caused a stir, and rightly so, because it was stunning, and if you didn't want to buy one of every single variety they had on display, then I don't think we can be friends. I was delighted to chat to Alec because I frankly have a checkered past with peonies. I've had peonies with wilt, and I've had peonies that don't flower. The best ones I've had in a garden were some I inherited in a house that I bought in Surrey. When they flowered, I rushed out to pick a load for the house and found they were overrun with ants. I've seen beautiful ones growing in other people's gardens and frankly, I've had peony envy. Determined to get to the bottom of my lack of success with peonies, I asked Alec about the most common problems gardeners face and he answered all these questions and more. We start out by discussing the different types on offer. My first question is, how many different types of peonies are there and can you explain the differences between them?
Well, there are hundreds of varieties of peonies out there, absolutely hundreds. We have about 260, 70 odd varieties in commercial production on the nursery at the moment, but there's simply thousands. 3 different types of peony I would broadly sort of break it down to. You've got your everyday sort of herbaceous peonies that people are familiar with, come back in the spring, die down in the autumn. You've got your tree peonies, not really trees, large bushes, although some of them can get to 8-10 foot tall if you leave them. And then you've got the relatively new ones. They're intersectional peonies. They're a cross between a tree peony and a herbaceous peony. Now they're really exciting actually because you get the best of both worlds. Now, they've been in the press a bit this year. They're starting to get a bit of traction. What's great about them is they flower generally for about twice as long as your average tree peony. So in peony terms, this is quite an amazing thing. One of the big criticisms of peonies often is that they don't flower for very long. But with an intersexual, you can get maybe 4, maybe even 5 weeks out of them. Now, the flowers aren't always as great as the weeks go on. They have secondary, sort of side shoots, side flowers, and they aren't as big or as impressive. But the point is you do get colour on them for 4 weeks or so. Mostly flowering around May, early June. They don't grow as tall as a tree peony. They probably only get to about 2'6", 3 foot tall. So they're quite compact. They do really well in containers. They make a perfect container plant, but just as happy in the border as well. Fantastic autumn colour on the foliage. Because they've got the tree peony frame, they don't tend to need peony supports, which again is another common complaint from gardeners that their peonies are always falling over. You don't get that with a herbaceous, with a intersectional peony. And huge flowers, fantastic colours, many of which are scented.
Mm-hmm. And so what's the difference between those and the herbaceous? What do the herbaceous, or what don't they have that the intersectional do?
Well, the herbaceous peonies, to start with, there's a lot more herbaceous peonies than people often think. People tend to get bogged down in the really old-fashioned red one that, Granny used to have in the garden. Pretty much indestructible, doesn't get very tall, doesn't flower for very long, but will live for about 80 to 100 years. They're virtually indestructible. Also really commonly known, Sarah Bernhardt, beautiful sugar pink, mid-season flowering, sort of end of May, beginning of June. Scented, makes an excellent cut flower. But there are many more varieties than that. And if you time your varieties correctly, you can have herbaceous peonies flowering in your garden in the UK from April through till the beginning of July. There's that many varieties.
That's a good point, actually. When they're in borders, do they need much space or can they take a bit of competition?
Most of the herbaceous peonies will get to kind of 2'6", 3 foot across. I would always recommend giving them a bit of space, bit of air around them to kind of breathe. It also stops sometimes with peony wilt, which is the only problem they really kind of suffer in the UK. So a bit of good airflow around them will help prevent that.
Okay. So you have mentioned peony wilt, which was one of my later questions, but would you like to just explain what that is, and is it fatal?
Well, first of all, no, it's not fatal. It happens in the UK every year. Generally, I find it's mid-June, early July time, kind of sweeps through the UK. Good hygiene is the key. So if you've got a healthy plant and it's not stressed, it's properly watered and it's healthy, it's got plenty of airflow around it, you know, the chances are you won't get peony wilt. However, it does happen. It's not detrimental. My best advice is to simply cut out the infected stems or parts of the plant and burn them. Disinfect your secateurs or what have you afterwards, because any other plant that's touched by the infected peony wilt will then obviously suffer. But you cut it out. It's not generally detrimental, and the following year the plant will grow, flower, no problems at all.
So at the moment in the garden, the peonies, kind of most of them, I suppose, have gone over or are starting to go over. What should people be doing with them at this time of the year?
Well, we're having really great weather at the moment, aren't we? So I would say enjoy them. And, you know, I get a lot of people talk to me at this time of year saying, oh, that peony's dying. I'm really disappointed. What shall I do? It's going brown at the edges. Well, that's quite common. It does happen. Peonies will suffer from a bit of scorch, and that's where the leaves go brown at the tip, if they've been a little bit dry in the summer months. But your peony right now is still growing, and it's putting together its flower buds under the ground. It's working really hard. It's putting together the flower buds for next year. So don't cut it back yet. Wait till it's properly died down, because the roots and the plant is still growing. I would cut them back towards the end of September, beginning of October. If you're thinking about moving your peony, again, wait until sort of October time. That's when your peony will be dormant. Right now, the peony is sending out lots of hairy little roots and getting ready for the winter. So you don't want to damage that kind of root structure. By the time we get to October, the peony will be pretty much dormant. Then you can divide it. Then you can move it. And, you know, it's an absolute old wives' tale that you can't move peonies. You can wait till October to do it. Dig a nice big piece of peony up, or take the whole thing up. When you're dividing it, make sure that you divide it with a clean spade or a sharp knife. And you want to make sure you've got between 3 and 5 little buds. You'll see them. They're either white or pink, very soft buds underneath the surface, probably an inch or two under the soil. And as long as you've got 3 or 4 buds on each piece, you can split your peony up and it'll be very happy.
Well, that's good to know. That's one wives' tale out the window. I don't know if people know whether to deadhead them or not either. Is there any benefit to doing that, or should you just leave them alone?
Well, I suppose if you were to read all the books, they would tell you that you should deadhead them regularly in the summer. I don't bother, if I'm honest with you. You know, I've got more important things to do with my life. The seed heads, when they develop, I think can be very attractive. They're like little court jester hats, aren't they? And some of them are brightly coloured. I think they look quite attractive in the summer months. But mostly it's pure laziness on my part. I guess in theory, if you cut the seed heads off, you know, more energy goes into the roots, the plant bulks up and is stronger overall.
Okay.
I grow 10, 15,000 peonies a year. I never cut them off, and I've not noticed any detrimental effect at all.
So with the tree peonies, is that a different story in terms of the care, or is that the same as the herbaceous and the intersectional peonies?
Well, yeah. Look, peonies are really easy to look after. You know, anyone who tells you that they're really difficult to grow, utter nonsense. The key to growing peonies well is to buy a well-established plant to start with. Peonies don't generally flower till they're at least 5 years old. For tree peonies, really, they don't flower reliably until they're 7 to 8 years old. So it takes a bit of time to get your peony to flower. If you buy a well-established plant to start with and put it in the garden, there's very little care and maintenance that you need to really think about. They're virtually indestructible. Most of them will live for 50, 60 years plus. As I said earlier, the old-fashioned one, rubra plana, that Granny used to have in the garden, the cottage garden, kind of red one, that will happily live for 100 years. They're not too fussy on soil, any kind of soil, as long as it's free draining. That's absolutely fine. And by the way, don't be afraid of a bit of clay. Peonies like soil with plenty of guts and a bit of strength to it. As long as it's not sitting in water over the winter, they'll be absolutely fine. So any old soil, any position in the garden, really. Full sun if you can get it. Some of them do very well in part shade. I would suggest a spot in the garden that's generally sheltered, just to protect some of the flowers, which can be delicate in the wind and the rain. But of course, if you're going for the intersectional peonies, they're a lot more robust. They will take a more exposed position because they're on a tree peony frame and they're only 2'6" high. So much better in a more windy position. So if you plant a well-established plant in the right place in the garden, and there's only 3 rules: any soil, as long as it's free draining, in a sunny spot if you can, and of course, finally, make sure you don't plant your herbaceous peony too deep. Now, they only want to be about 1 inch or 2 below the surface. So if you plant them any deeper than that, they will never flower. It's as simple as that. If you're very diligent in your garden and you mulch your borders, be mindful not to mulch over your peony, because you will bury it, and over a period of time it will stop flowering. So if you plant it in the right place at the right depth, pretty much, unless you've got really light sandy soil, you probably don't need to feed it that often. You certainly don't need to do any kind of pruning or deadheading unless you feel that you absolutely must. Of course, you'll need to cut the plant down to the ground in October time when it's dead, but it'll be obvious, it'll be brown and flopped over. And that's it. And you've got very, very low maintenance plant that's going to last for decades and decades. Now, with tree peonies, you don't have to prune them. You really don't. But they do respond very well to a good prune in October. And you've got a couple of choices here. You can take them down by kind of a third. If you've got a tree peony that's got multiple stems coming out of the ground, you can kind of treat it a bit like a hydrangea and take out the old stems, every third one maybe, and kind of every other year take out the old stems, and that will just thin it out and keep it healthy. But you don't have to. Tree peonies just will look after themselves. As I say, really low maintenance. And as a plant, they don't suffer from pests and diseases very much. So you haven't really got to worry about slugs, snails, rabbits, deer. It's not an issue for them. In fact, people often talk to me about ants. They say, I've got lots of ants on my peony.
I was going to ask you that, and I just thought, it's bound to be they're farming the aphids. But yes, I have had that.
Well, they do eat the aphids, although peonies don't generally suffer from aphids. What they're really doing is, and I don't know if you've ever done this, when the buds are forming, they are covered in really sweet, sticky sap. Now, I'm not suggesting you should go in the garden and lick your peonies, but unfortunately, for me, when I'm dealing with them all in the spring, I get it all over me. And actually, if you do put your finger in your mouth, you will find that sugary sap is incredibly sweet. It's like honey, and that's what the ants are eating. They're doing absolutely no harm to the plant, and we don't use any kind of control over ants in the nursery at all. I'm quite happy for them to run through the nursery. In fact, they do a good job, because by eating that sugary sap on the bud, they actually encourage the bud to open. So in some ways, they're doing a really good job for you. So yeah, no harm with ants. There's nothing really that causes any trouble to peonies.
When you said that if you were growing them on a light soil, you might need to feed them, what would you feed them with? Or if maybe they were in a container?
Yeah, certainly if your peony's in a container, and we have a whole range of peonies that have been bred specifically for patios and containers that do really well in pots. But any peony kept in a pot, yeah, you're going to need to remember to water it well and feed it. Now, with feed, I would recommend using our Primrose Hall spring feed in the spring and our Primrose Hall summer rejuvenator from kind of July onwards, when the plant has finished flowering. Once a year is enough. You really don't need to go over the top. Certainly, I would not recommend feeding it with, tomerite, phosphorogen, or anything like that. That's really not going to do very much good to the plant, and certainly it won't encourage it to flower because, as I said earlier, the peony develops its flower the previous year. Right now, in September time, it's putting together its bud for next year. So if you start feeding it in the spring, that's not going to help it flower next year. All it's really going to do is strengthen up the roots so it produces lots of bud for the following year.
You mentioned, obviously, if you plant it too deep, it won't flower. And also, there was something else you said. Oh, if it was too young. But if are there any other reasons why they might not produce flowers?
Yes, there's only a couple of reasons that your peony will either not flower or stop producing flower. And it really is very, very simple. The first one, as you said, is the maturity of the plant. It has to be mature enough to start with. And most peonies you buy in garden centres generally are pretty immature. The second thing is it has to be planted at the correct depth. Now, you'll know if you planted it at the correct depth because it will have flowered previously. So if it starts to flower, you know you've got it at the right depth and you know it's at the right maturity. So if it starts to stop flowering, then your problem is almost certainly too much shade. So cut a few branches back. Ultimately, if you have to, wait till October, dig it up and move it to a more sunny spot. But generally speaking, it's going to be one of three things: maturity of the plant, planting depth, or in fact, it's just got too much shade. And can I just go back to planting depth very briefly? So I said that with herbaceous peonies, they want to be planted no more than 1 to 2 inches below the surface. Now, it's not a problem if your peony, if the crown of it's actually on the surface. That really isn't a problem at all. Peonies are hardy down to about minus 20 degrees, so there's nothing the English UK winters can throw at them they can't handle. They really are pretty robust. In fact, they need a period, I would say 16 to 18 weeks of temperatures below 15 degrees to enable them to actually initiate that bud properly and to flower the following year. So if you've got a really hot climate, Australia or South Africa or somewhere like that, if you're not careful, the peony just won't flower. So they need the cold weather, which is perfect in this country for peonies. But going back to the planting depth, with tree peonies, it's the opposite. So with tree peonies, what you want to do is make sure you're planting it kind of 6 inches deep. There'll be a graft union on your tree peony usually. Most tree peonies sold in the UK are grafted. It's always a good idea, I think, to make sure that graft union is a good 6 inches below the surface. And that will do a couple of things. One is it will give the plant more stability. Certainly, some of the more dodgy rootstocks, the grafting isn't great. And after a period of time, the tree could be 10, 15, 20 years old. That graft can fail and you've lost everything. Secondly, if the union is below the surface, it gives the tree peony itself the chance to put out its own roots. And that will stop some of the suckers coming up. And the suckers are a problem, let me tell you. If you leave the suckers thinking, oh, this is great, I've got another little herbaceous peony growing down here, that is literally killing your tree peony every day. So when you see those suckers, take those bad boys out straight away because they are never going to do any good.
Okay. And would you do that like you would a rose sucker?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other misconceptions around peonies? I was just thinking about the fallacy of not being able to move them. Are there any other things that drive you up the wall when people say it to you because you know it's not true?
Well, obviously the maturity of the plant is one thing. They take a long time to flower, 5 years. So they're really easy to grow. People often think peonies are difficult to grow. And that's only half true. So I was being a bit unfair when I said they're dead easy earlier. They're actually quite complicated to get from zero, from a seed, to a flowering plant. That does take a bit of time. So the seed itself requires 2 winters. It's a double vernalization process. It's got to have 2 cold winters. So if you get a seed and you sow it and you put it in the garden, you won't see anything germinate on that for 2 years. You've got to wait for it to go through 2 winters. So that takes a bit of time. Then your plant, they grow quite slowly. It'll probably take 5 years before that plant will flower. So it can take a long time for the plant to bulk up. So if a friend has given you a peony they've grown from seed, treasure it, look after it, but be patient. And it's the same with tree peonies. They don't tend to flower reliably till they're 7 to 8 years old. So be patient. As I say, if you buy a well-established plant, and all of the plants that we sell are minimum 5 years old, tree peonies are minimum 7 years old. They're at flowering maturity. You'll be fine. But that's the first thing. Buy a well-established plant. It makes your life a lot easier. The other thing people tend to say to me is, peonies aren't scented, are they? And again, I would say that's more wrong than true. I would say 95% of all the peonies I grow are scented. There are 5 main scents with peonies, and the scent is obviously always stronger in the morning. And some peonies have a stronger scent than others. A little bit subjective, but they're nearly all scented. Don't feel that you've got to go for a peony that doesn't have a scent, because there are literally hundreds of thousands of them that you can choose from. I will give you a word of warning, though. You may have come across the coral ones, coral charm, coral sunsets, pink Hawaiian coral, etched salmon. Yeah, absolutely beautiful flowers. And if you haven't seen them, take a look there's loads of pictures on Instagram. There's some on our website too. They are incredible flowers, slightly different shape, but they all have the same thing in common, which is that they open a bright, bright hot pink, and they fade over the course of 4 or 5 days. They fade through peach and coral and lemon, and then they fade finally to kind of a dirty cream color. So the color change on it is fantastic. And when you look at one plant, which might have 30 or 40 flower heads on it, it looks like a tequila sunrise, of color. It's absolutely stunning. Great flower. Unfortunately, the scent on those coral ones is not great. They are scented, but it's not great. It's very often described as just a little bit fishy.
Oh.
Now, they're the only ones I've ever found that have a bad smell. All of the other peonies smell nice, but just beware of the coral ones. They look great, but don't necessarily smell so good.
Well, I bet there were a lot of disappointed brides this year, because I'm sure that was a very in colour. So.
Oh, it's been very in for a number of years. And in fact, this year I think was the Pantone colour of the year was coral.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's interesting to know. I was just thinking about what you said about cutting them back in October. In my garden, I'm just a part of me is lazy, and part of me just leaves everything over winter. If I were to leave the dead foliage on top of the crown over winter, would that be a problem? Do I really need to remove those leaves?
Okay, good question. So all of the stuff that I grow in containers, I cut back every year. The stuff in the field, generally, I don't get time to do it. And if I'm honest with you, I'll drive over it with the flail and I'll just chop it like I cut the grass. And I don't tend to clean that up then until the spring. So it doesn't really cause too much of an issue. Good practice dictates that you should cut it down in the winter, clear it away, and basically that's good hygiene. And you reduce the risk of getting wilt and other kind of diseases in the garden, because you're taking away the dead and rotting, nasty material. I don't think it's particularly detrimental. And again, I'm quite relaxed about peony wilt. I don't tend to worry about it. Cut it out, burn it. It's not the end of the world.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good to know. So when is the best time to order and plant your peonies, if you're thinking about it?
Well, you've got 2 choices with peonies. You can buy bare root, or you can buy a containerized plant. And there are pros and cons for both. Bare root, my advice is buy it now. September, October, November. That's the time for bare root. I'm very disappointed when I see people selling bare roots after Christmas. Any bare root you buy after Christmas will have been dug up in a field in August, September time, and then kept in a chiller cabinet or a fridge until it's dispatched to you. They do deteriorate. They dry out and they deteriorate while they're out of the ground. So if you have a plant, a bare root, and it's shipped to you in April, it's not going to be fresh, it's not going to flower for you that year either, and you're going to struggle.
Right.
So my advice with bare root is order it, buy it, take delivery September, October, November time, and get it in the ground straight away. Mm-hmm. Subject to the planting rules I said earlier. Don't plant it too deep. Plant it in a sunny spot and make sure you've got free draining soil.
Okay.
The big advantage of bare roots is that they are usually substantially cheaper. So you can save a bit of money, but you're going to have to do some of the hard work in planting it, getting it in the right spot, and getting it going. On the other hand, if you go for a container grown plant that's well established, it will cost you more money, but all of the work's been done for you. And you can plant a container grown peony at any time of the year. It doesn't really matter. And it certainly shouldn't stop it from flowering. And if you buy containerized peonies from us, they are shipped out at 5 years maturity. They ought to flower in the first year for you.
So where could people find out more about your nursery? Do you do any of the shows?
Well, yes, we do. We usually do Chelsea, Hampton Court, Tatton Park, Chatsworth. We get around Cardiff. We get around all over the UK. We're usually at Gardeners World too, which is always good fun. You can find out about us on the website, which is www.primrosehallpeonies.co.uk. Follow us on Facebook or on Twitter and on the Instagram thing. I'm not sure how it works. I think it's at Primrose Hall UK, but there you are. But yeah, you can find out loads of information about peonies and about the nursery. And all of the plants that we supply, we do send out with a full care guide with planting instructions and care.
And in case you're keen to follow Primrose Hall Peonies on that Instagram thing or any other social media channels, I've put links to those and to the nursery in the show notes. As always, I'd like to thank my guest Alec for taking the time to speak to me and to educate us all about peonies. Please do go and look at the Primrose Hall website, and don't forget, if you want lots of these stunning flowers in your garden next year, now's the time to get ordering and planting. Thanks to you for listening, and I'll catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.